What you see, what you see on the screen is the result of your collective thinking about climate resilient development. So this is what we think. A few things to note. First, this was done at the beginning of day one, basically. If I hadn't showed it, we could do it at the end of the last day. You play Snap with different people, and you, as an organizer of the event, can see how people's thinking changed. Did all this exposure to climate resilient development make a difference, or do we still think that it's vulnerability, adaptation, exposure? I must say, many of these things I've seen before without the climate resilient development. What is different? What are we going to do differently? That's an important challenge. I wish you good luck. Thanks, and there shall be more.
Thank you, Pablo, and for keeping us entertained at lunch. So welcome back, and thank you for joining us, those of you online. We are just having our final session today, esteemed panel of guests talking to us about the Climate Resilient Development Framework, how it relates to some different applications than we heard in the previous one. What I'll just sort of tee up from page 3 in the Climate Resilient Development Framework is a discussion kind of why. Why did we come up with this framework, and why not something else? Why did we actually think that this needed to be said versus what was being done before? And there are a few points specific to the way we start and frame discussions about climate resilient development, and actually reflecting on the experience that led us to this point that often started with climate information. We often see in a country, if there is a question about adaptation, well, let's look at the climate data. And this clearly, from what you've heard already, does things differently from that. And you can see some reasons, and we'll come back to that a little bit later, I think. But maybe as we listen to these presentations, we can see how that's being addressed, perhaps similarly or differently from what you've seen. So let's start off with Joanne.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. I'm very glad to be here and to talk with you about how we can advance climate resilience in very different contexts. And Jason was saying earlier about how important context is, and I'd like to describe the experience we've had working at the local government level with the Climate Resilient Infrastructure Services Project. And first of all, it's okay, why infrastructure? And this is not infrastructure as an adaptation measure. This is infrastructure that is part and parcel of development. So infrastructure is critical to development. In a lot of developing areas, it's expanding extremely rapidly. And a lot of money is being spent. Infrastructure is really expensive, and once you build it, it's there for a long time. It's threatened by climate change, and if it's designed based on past conditions rather than on future conditions, it's not likely to be sustainable. So USA designed the Climate Resilient Infrastructure Services program with the goal of ensuring that the development that happens and the infrastructure services that are provided are sustainable in the context of climate change, even given climate change over the long haul. And also to develop and test and disseminate approaches that other local governments and other governments, period, can use. So we set out to identify pilot cities around the world that would be good test beds for trying the climate resilient development framework and seeing how it works in practice on the ground. And our criteria were size. We were looking at not mega cities, but smaller cities that are growing very rapidly, that are very vulnerable to climate impacts, that have a broad portfolio of infrastructure to test this out on, that care about it, that are interested in working with us, and also have the capacity to take on being a pilot, because it is a commitment on the city's part. And the mission in that country being interested in the work that we were doing, and that there was a good chance of replicability, so that the lessons we learned by working with these cities would be relevant to other cities around the world. So we identified 4 pilot cities, and Cascadia had already been working with Hue in Vietnam, so that got us up to 5. And there were 2 in Peru, Piura and Trujillo in Peru. In Dominican Republic, we worked with Santo Domingo. In Mozambique, we worked with Nacala-Porto. And each of those cities met those criteria. And our approach was first to develop a very tailored work plan with each of those cities. It was different for each city based on where they were, what their priorities were, what their capacity was. But it was the work plans were designed around the CRD framework. And one thing I want to say about the CRD framework is that this may give the impression that it's a very linear process. Not a linear process. You know, there's a lot of feedback among these different stages. It's an ongoing, iterative process. There was a real basic need for climate education with each of our cities. There was a lot of confusion about what climate change was, about the distinction between climate change and weather, about why climate was a relevant stressor in their decision-making process. And these are cities that all have enough on their plates. You know, they have big challenges in terms of poverty, in terms of informal settlements, in terms of providing basic services. So the question was, why is climate relevant to the decisions you're making? So we developed some very basic Climate 101 training that we found was useful to begin the dialogue with city staff. As we went further, we've developed tools with city staff to help them implement the stages in the framework. And these tools I'll describe more on Wednesday, but to just give you an appetizer, there are different tools that are targeted toward non-expert users, practitioners at the local government level. And there was a big focus on institutionalizing climate into core decision-making processes rather than making this a separate process, and obviously that's a core tenet of the CRD framework. So we worked with different cities to mainstream climate risk into the decisions they're already making. A key to that was developing interdisciplinary working groups to bring the infrastructure folks and the environment folks and the planning folks together and work in that fashion, and to bring in experts from outside the city government, to bring in stakeholders from the universities and private sector players to participate. A lot of staff training so that staff who learned about the process were able to train their colleagues, and then action plans for steps that the city would take after Chris pulled out. Finally, we're really focused on replication, and so peer learning was a very important component. And we had a study tour in Mozambique that just wrapped up. I'll tell you more on Wednesday about that as well. A very successful peer learning event in Santo Domingo, and presentations on the Chris approach at several venues that are really focused on cities. And I see our friend from START here who was organizing the Cities at Risk event in Durban, which was a very useful way of bringing city decision makers together in the subcontinent. So a few lessons learned to share with you about the CRIS experience. One is that the development first approach does actually work, we found, with local governments, that staying focused on the decisions they're making rather than bringing, whole boatloads of climate data and projections in. It's like, what decisions are you making? What climate information is relevant to the decisions you're making? And starting with their goals and objectives and the decisions they're making actually works for them. It makes sense. Following that, decision relevant climate information is critical, and we did work to develop a climate information framework that really aims to help practitioners identify which climate data actually matters to the decision they're making. And that's if they're planning a bridge, they need different type of climate information than if they're managing their solid waste program. And so really trying to cut through all the model outputs and identify what they should care about. Tools make a difference. There's a big hunger for accessible tools that can be used to come out with input that's relevant to the decision maker's job. And a way of building and institutionalizing climate approaches is through the technical collaboration that extends beyond the local government managers. And that's what I've got to say. So I have a minute extra for Glenn Anderson. It's good. Thank you.
I will use it wisely.
Thank you, Joanne. That's excellent, and I know that ICF brings a lot of its experience, having worked in the U.S. on some of these infrastructure issues, to the work overseas, and so that's absolutely very interesting. Glenn, I will pass to you, and if you feel like making a comment on the question from the earlier session, you could do that.
Oh, okay. The question that was asked about the private sector involvement, I hosted a panel last September in the Philippines on public-private partnerships in climate change. And it was interesting, and I started doing a little research, and it had been the first time that the COP had ever formally acknowledged the private sector was in 2013. The private sector has been on the sideline, and I found this really just very surprising for several reasons. One is most of the innovation that goes on in the world is done in the private sector. Just look at the IT, look at all the apps and all the improvements that have been made in communications. Second is take a look at the interest rates that the World Bank and the African Development Bank use. They're like 10 to 12%, and there's a reason for that. They're trying not to crowd out the private sector. They don't want to. The private sector doesn't want to have to compete with them. And so the other thing is there's a really big role for the private sector to play in insurance, particularly in terms of insuring against disasters and the like. And so whether it's public-private partnerships or just more private sector engagement, there's really an opportunity and there's really a need to bring in. The other thing I found is if you look at the money that gets invested in developing countries, if you have 100%, what percentage do you think is coming from ODA, official direct assistance? It's only 10%. The private sector is accounting for well over 50% of the investments that are being made in developing countries. So I think that partly I believe that because adaptation was sort of owned by ministries of environment and is only now being mainstreamed more and to involve ministries of finance, there's a much greater opportunity now to bring the private sector into a lot of the adaptation planning that goes on.
Right. I realized Joanne was giving you her minute by choice, not by order, so we'll go back to Jason Vogel.
Complete choice.
Hello, Jason Vogel with Abt Associates again. In the afternoon. I want to speak with you briefly here about a case study we were able to do utilizing both the framework and the water annex, which was a water security and climate change assessment of Iloilo, Philippines. And just to put it in context, or saying context is important, hopefully most of you know the Philippines is a small East Asian island chain just north of Indonesia, sort of southeast of China. But it's a lot of islands. And one of those middle islands is the island, oops, that's not the laser, there's a laser, the island of Panay here. These red outlines are provinces, so we're looking here at the province of Iloilo, and then this is Iloilo City, this red municipality, the gray divisions here, municipality divisions. But it's a water assessment. You can't really just look at a city and do a water assessment. You really have to look at the watershed. And this, believe it or not, is the best map we could find of the watershed on this island. And we're looking here at the Tigumaganan watershed. Iloilo City is here. You can see those same outlines for municipalities. So we were really looking at this entire watershed to do this assessment. The study had 3 official objectives, which you can see here. I won't read them in excruciating detail, but kind of go over them quickly, if I can turn the page here. Identifying, it was really focused on their goal of economic growth, but looking at how water and climate risks play into that goal. Trying to engage local partners to the extent possible in a relatively short project, and then actually identifying and analyzing a set of adaptation options for this area based on the risks that they face. And then we had this bonus objective down here, which was to pilot USAID's Climate Resilient Development Framework and the Water Annex. This is the first time we actually rolled it out in the field. This is in 2012, so it's before either of those documents were published. And then to use the lessons learned, trying to actually do something with it to refine those documents and make them better. And I'm just going to give you a quick on each of these pictures because they're interesting. This is this is a groundwater well, cap on a groundwater well, and this is a woman doing her laundry. Not surprisingly, the water that comes out of that groundwater well is not very good to drink. Almost everyone in Iloilo drinks bottled water, even the poorest of the poor. So there's a lot of challenges here. Quickly on the assessment methodology, it was a 2-week project. We spent time both in Manila and Iloilo. The team included 2 USAID staff, 4 technical development experts, including a water resources engineer, someone that could translate the hydrology and the specifics of the equipment we were looking at, a water governance lawyer who could really dig through the fairly intensive government context we were in, and then 2 climate change and adaptation specialists. We did a lot of literature review before we landed so we could really know what we were walking into. A lot of stakeholder consultations from permanent secretaries of ministries down to some of the local homeless population to get that full range of views, and then a number of site visits as well. Oh, and I wanted to do the picture. So there you see, this is on a boat coming from the island of Guimaras just across the strait here, and you can see that's the municipal government complex, but these are houses on stilts right next to the dock where we're about to land. When a typhoon comes, not if, these are not good places to be. So, vulnerability is pretty widespread. So I wanted to connect this directly with the methodology of using the framework, because breaking it down, this it doesn't really help you understand too much, except I really want to agree with Joanne here that it's not a linear process, it's iterative. You really have to tailor it to your needs, and I'll show you a little bit how we did that. Some of the things we did while we were here first was identifying those key development goals. And this is largely by speaking with them, getting to know what they really cared about. We did run into a lot of people that cared from the private sector, the tourism industry, Chamber of Commerce, that were some of the most engaged people because they saw climate as a serious threat to their economic development objectives. Mm-hmm. We identified key inputs. What are those things that they needed for development? It included they wanted to promote tourism, they needed a clean river, they needed to have a better pier so that people could go across the island to Guimaras. We identified a lot of climate and non-climate stressors. I think I list them on the next page, so I won't go into that here. We assessed vulnerability, but it was quick. It was an expert judgment style vulnerability assessment. We did not do an intensive mathematical modeling exercise, and you don't have to always do that. In the context of this project, it was enough to sit down and think logically through the risks that they faced and come up with some pretty solid conclusions about where their major vulnerabilities were and where we should look for solutions. And then we went into the design stage where we actually identified 22 different adaptation options We did also select evaluation criteria and evaluate those options to give presumably decision makers locally the information they might need to then implement on something. So I don't want to dive through this. These are pretty obvious. We identified climate stressors. We looked in the literature. We talked to the locals to figure out what really mattered to them. You can see them here. It's not surprising. It's an agriculturally dependent area as well as having a city. So we're worried about basically too much water, too little water, and dirty water. Droughts, typhoons, temperatures, the onset of the monsoons, that's all relevant to them. Non-climate stressors, just to save time, kind of brushing through these. Low service levels. This is actually where the meat of our case ended up. It was the non-climate stressors that drove the vulnerability more so than the climate stressors, which doesn't mean that the climate stressors were irrelevant. It means that, in some cases they were sort of tipping the system into something unsustainable. But there was low service levels. Somewhere between 20 and 40% of the population had water delivered to them, depending on who you talk to, what time of day. Turns out that that doesn't necessarily mean that they got water 24 hours a day. They might get water for 2 hours between midnight and 2 a.m. So they wake up, fill up their tank. Poor distribution infrastructure. This is an example of that here. Blue pipes coming out from underneath the concrete. One of them goes back into the curb concrete. This one's duct taped. The water that came out of the water treatment facility, I would have drank. The water that comes out of these pipes, no one drinks. The locals don't drink it. They all buy bottled water. They have, unfortunately, inadequate tariffs. The way their system is set up, they can't charge the amount of money they need for the water delivery in order to actually invest in the distribution system and fix this problem. So they have perfectly clean water coming out of a centralized facility that goes and becomes dirty on the way to wherever the 20% of households that get it. You see some of the others here. A lot of them are common across a lot of developing country contexts: urban development and floodplain, poor water governance, high population growth, unemployment and poverty. But I want to focus quickly on one that really shone through in this case study, which is the poor water governance in Iloilo, but also in the Philippines generally. To dive into just the superficial level of what that means, there are over 20 government policies and legal instruments that govern the management of water in the Philippines, and over 30 institutions that actually have some level of authority across those 20 governmental instruments. So you have a lot of people with veto power, very few people willing to stick their neck out to get things done. Not surprisingly, you end up with a lot of institutional actors. They have overlapping, unclear mandates and authorities. It's really hard to get things done, even really obvious stuff. This is, just to hit the picture again, that is their sewer line. Those are their homes. So I just going to brush the surface. I told you there were 22 adaptation options that we identified. I'm just hitting a few here for illustrative purposes. Categorically, at this level, some information-based options, developing a long-term monitoring program, something that they really cared about, particularly for flooding issues. An information clearinghouse. They couldn't get information. They didn't know anything about their watershed. Different ministries and departments and agencies had different information they weren't sharing. This may sound familiar to many of you. The Med Agency, no offense to Med agencies, but they had to charge for their products in order to stay afloat. So they couldn't get information about historical climate either. Some of the governance-based options here, enhanced land use planning. There's fundamentally zero land use planning going into this area. Some of the things I mentioned earlier: civil society capacity building, really empowering the local people who cared, those people that were involved in the tourism board. There's local neighborhood associations, enhancing public-private partnerships, improving sector accountability, and then on water security. Some things that might seem a little more normal for water security assessment: a sanitation, information education campaign, reducing the non-revenue water from the Metropolitan Iloilo Water District. They lose somewhere between 40 and 60% of their water through their distribution system. And potentially community-based water supply and treatment options. If dirty water shows up at your doorstep, if you can treat it there, you don't have to buy bottled water. And when you count up the number of bottles of water you buy over the course of how many years, when do you pay for it? So quickly, I wanted to drop in and show you the evaluation of these adaptation options, and caveat this with, even though tables like this look sexy and you want to draw conclusions from them, don't do it, right? This is a simplification of the reality of these adaptation options, but it's useful if used smartly. So just quickly, since I have to end, these are the options. We categorize the various options as infrastructure, capacity building, policy governance, good management practices, just to give a sense to people who might implement these. Am I doing infrastructure or not? You could just eliminate certain things. Vulnerability addressed, is this about water quality, water supply, or flooding? Just check marks. This is the really interesting stuff where we actually dug in, looked at the effectiveness, feasibility, and cost of these options. Those are supposed to be yellow, I think, but
Yellow on there.
yeah, so whatever. And then implementation timing. You can really pick the things that matter in the context of wherever you're at, but implementation timing is another one where do you care about things, do you need to get something done before the next election cycle because you're an elected official? Go for short. Are you an NGO trying to look at the long-term validity of this option? Maybe you go for the long. So with that, I've finished a minute over, but maybe net kind of 0.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jason. Great. I think this is a really good example of the climate and non-climate and how they come together. We had heard, I got to go on that trip, about a lot of the dimensions of those problems, and that, you know, it was getting worse, that actually there were dried up intakes from surface water, and so it was becoming much more pressing. But clearly that was partly climate change and partly, you know, inefficiency. So great illustration of that. Glenn, take it away.
Okay, thanks. I'm going to be talking about Kazakhstan climate resilient wheat integration pilot. And, oh, wrong side. This is a project, it's one of the integration pilots that Rolf mentioned earlier. There were 10 of them. This one was awarded to USAID Central Asia. It was implemented by UNDP. And our project was asked to provide some support, and we supported them in terms of climate vulnerability assessment for the wheat sector and agriculture more broadly, to focus on climate information, regional dialogue on food security. And then I would add that we ended up doing quite a bit of capacity building and did a couple of training of trainers. And in terms of outreach, we produced an 8-minute video that is posted on the USAID Central Asia Republic's website that focuses on field demonstrations that were done during the summer of 2013. We followed the Climate Resilient Development Framework, but mostly we focused on stakeholder processes, trying to understand what the development objectives were. We also wanted to find out how much farmers knew about climate change, and that turned out to be quite interesting and revealing. And so we had a series of stakeholder workshops. We did the first 4. First was national, 3 local. And we, in the workshops we asked people, first questions we asked were, what are your challenges that you face in the sector, in the wheat sector? Not climate change at all. We tried to find out what access they had to climate information and whether it was useful. It wasn't. We found out a bit about their perceptions of climate change. They pretty much had no sense of the long-term climate change, but they dealt with variability every season. And so they were mainly focused on climate variability. And then we looked at climate impacts in the sector and different options for addressing vulnerability. We also had there was a survey that was done, an informal survey done of farmers by UNDP that we asked for. And we did some training of trainers workshops, and then our trainers went out and did a series of about 10 to 12 workshops, and they trained over 400 people in climate adaptation. And we put together all of the findings from these workshops, and we're in the process of writing a sort of final paper on findings and recommendations. Just quickly, well, that doesn't come very good on color. Kazakhstan's development goals for wheat. The first thing it's important to recognize is Kazakhstan's the 9th largest producer of wheat in the world, and it's the 7th largest exporter. And those arrows going off is where their exports go, with about almost half going to Central Asia, and surprisingly 15% to European countries. They have an implementation plan to industrialize the ag sector by 2020, and they're trying to improve cultivation methods, application of improved seed and chemicals, and diversification of crops. So their main development goals we found were to increase wheat production, strengthen food security in Central Asia, modernize the sector, and adapt to climate variability and change. Some of the challenges they face in the sector, really independent of climate for the most part, at the farm level is they need to adopt advanced cultivation practices and technologies, and diversify away from wheat monoculture, particularly into legumes and oilseed crops. These are a small farm in Kazakhstan. One farmer said, "I'm one of the little guys. I only have 30,000 hectares." These are enormous farms. And the reason they're so large is that the farmers don't own the land. The land is all leased from the government. And so that you see very large 100,000 hectare farms, which in the United States or Canada would be considered, almost a whole state in some cases. But there's a lot of problems in the sector at the sector level, the national policy level. They need to strengthen their ag research and extension service, improve weather, climate, market information and forecasts, improve access to financing, and they've got to reform tariffs. I don't see that happening very quickly. You can import machinery from Russia and Belarus and pay no tariff at all, and if you import it from other countries, you pay 20%. And they need to restructure their crop insurance program. They haven't changed the cost of farming since 2005. They're still using the same numbers from 2005. Wheat production varies all over the place. 2011 was a record year, and it was also a year that the farmers lost money. 2009 was a very good year. Farmers made money. 2010, they lost money. 2011, they lost money. 2012, they lost money. 2013, they lost money. And in 2014, over 25% of the yields, the crop yield was still in the field because of late season rains. So this is a country that grows a lot of wheat, but the farmers are not making a lot of money. They're losing money. And a lot of this has to do with variability, seasonal variability. This is over a period of 2000 to 2012. This shows the maximum and minimum precipitation in each month in one of the growing regions. And the growing season is planting in May, harvesting in late September and October. So you can see that there's quite a bit of variability there. There's also quite a bit of variability from year to year. And you can see that they had huge deficits in the years where the yields were quite low. How am I doing on time? 3? Oh, good. Okay, in terms of improving resilience, and we've always thought about this project in terms of resilience, in part because when it became clear that farmers aren't making a lot of money, faced with a lot of variability, how do you make investments if you're constantly going from making a little bit of money and losing money almost every year? And so the focus in this sector is not on long-term climate change, but on climate variability, drought, heat extremes, late summer rain, cool temperatures. Some of the things that we think will help improve soil management, using no and low-till cultivation, mulching, better snow retention. This is all mainly focused on dealing with drought. The other thing that's important is improve farm-level decision-making. better access to and use of climate information, guidance on planting time, seed varieties, crop selection, access to information. The big issue in terms of increasing resilience is to address those non-climate stressors to increase profits. Higher savings gives you higher adaptive capacity, and it gives you higher resilience. Just a couple of lessons learned. One thing that's very interesting here is that you've almost got to tailor things between family farms and commercial farms. Commercial farms hire agronomists. They can understand and interpret weather data. They understand market information, and they know all about the different technologies and methods for producing both wheat and other kinds of crops. And so we found that in stakeholder workshops, the big farmers would dominate because they were really smart and they knew what they were doing. We helped develop extension service training curricula, actually used Pablo's game, as which we adjusted for agriculture and drought. But there needs to be a very differentiated response to climate information in terms of having both an understanding of that information and, more importantly, the capacity to be able to take any kind of action. If you don't have resources, it doesn't matter how good the forecast is. You can't do anything with it. The other thing that we're discovering is because non-climate stressors were so important that we still don't really have the good common metrics we need to compare climate vulnerability to impacts of non-climate stressors. You know, trying to assess climate, the solutions to climate and non-climate stressors, we have to continue to work to have a set of metrics to deal with that. The other thing that's interesting about working in a sector is we often find that money is not fungible between adaptation and development, that finance gets siloed. Adaptation money goes for adaptation, development money goes for development. But for farmers, they could care less. For farmers, they need to know what's the best solution for me. Do I invest in some of these methods to deal with soil moisture, or do I diversify my crops and put investments in things like that? So I think I'll stop there.
Great, thanks. Thanks, Glenn. I think you ended on a really interesting question about capacity to take action and how much that is factoring into the information and the programs we're designing. Moving on to Michael to tell us about small grants.
So my name is Michael Cody. I happen to be the communications director for the CCRD project. And one of my interests with several areas of this project is to communicate several pieces of our project to the right people through the right methodology, using the right methodologies. And Jim Beiser brought up a really good point earlier today about how some of the research can actually continue or live on within USAID. And I'm trying, one of my roles in my contract in CCRD is to kind of fill that gap. So I'm going to just go through just a few slides on our small grants program and then end with a question to you, and maybe we can have a conversation later. The role of the small grants program in our CCRD contract is basically to discover, create, test innovative ways to implement the CRD development first approach. In essence, it's a sandbox of research in adaptation. The program runs, our small grants program runs through the summer of 2015, but early results indicate that activities that we've supported measurably increase the resilience of both stakeholders and also raise the capacity of the grantees themselves. And I'll show you why. By the numbers, the CCRD Small Grants Program is $3.3 million. We have 36 small grants. Some are closed, some are still continuing. There's an asterisk here because this number is actually 35. One of them was canceled because of a security situation that happened in Pakistan in 2012. But the rest are running smoothly. We have 6 areas of focus, basically 6 categories of these 36 grants. We have 11 climate scientists. We've heard from Alton Byers earlier today from TMI. Under the HIMAP program, there are actually 11 researchers that we supported, and they did field research in Nepal and Peru. And in essence, they helped highland and lowland communities, both in the Andes and Himalayas. We have 9 academic grants. They support U.S. and international universities and research institutes to develop new research methods and tools to support adaptation planning and implementation. Joanne Potter showed you the CRIS program. Underneath the CRIS program, the Climate Resilient Infrastructure Services Program, there are 5 small grants. And they focus basically to support and fill some of the gaps that the CRIS program is tasked with. So basically, they're still focusing on protecting infrastructure in coastal cities. They're piloting a fast track of the CRD framework, which I have a really nice document that's going to roll out in about a month on fast track implementation. We also have 5 sole source grants. They support specific areas of CCRD. So they support the development of various communities of practice. They support workshops, and they also provided logistical support for some of our programs. We have 3 climate services grants for farmers in Africa and South Asia. Those, again, fill gaps in design, delivery, and use of climate information for risk management for smallholder farmers. And then finally, we have 3 climate resilient agriculture grantees in Central America. Alex will be presenting on some of those things tomorrow morning, in fact. Small grants are global. There's 22 of them. Well, we worked basically in 22 countries. But several of them, they're kind of clustered in these regions. Here's Nepal. There's 11 of them here. So those areas. So our climate scientists, we have, again, we have 11 of them. Uliana on the right, on the left, and Jeff Cargill and researcher Greg Leonard. They're going to present some of their research tomorrow. Thanks, Deborah. One of the things with our small grants, this is from a contract or management perspective, is that we discovered was that some of the applications, some of the quality of applications that we received for our solicitations, quality was quite low. And midstream, we had to figure out how to address that problem. So Glenn and his team developed a solution. They brainstormed to resolve this low capacity of applications. This low quality of applications by creating something called write shops. In essence, they are workshops that help potential or prospective grantees learn how to actually write a solicitation. So what that actually did as a result was it greatly improved the quality of applications. Incidentally, it raised the capacity of those grantees. Once they won the grant, it raised their capacity of these recipients to manage their respective grants. So they were better positioned to address issues such as compliance and reporting. So those write shops were quite successful. I'm going to write a report on how those things were developed. So finally, the next steps for the small grants program. Since I'm the communications director, I'm going to focus on how to get a lot of these research innovations and tools into the minds of stakeholders, donors, and USAID. And the way that I intend to do that is to first publish a very detailed project portfolio. It's going to list all 36 grants in detail. It'll talk about what tools were created and what methodologies were tested. And then I'm going to take that really detailed report and squish it down to 10 pages. We already have a draft of our portfolio. It's at about 75 pages. And as everyone has mentioned earlier today, that's too much for USAID to read. They're really busy people. So I need to squish that down to 5 or 7 pages. Wish me luck on that. But in essence, what I really want to do is share the lessons learned from a small grants program in order for USAID to, actually think about how we can keep some of that research going to support CRD programming going forward. I'm going to end now, a little early, but if anyone has ideas on how I can better communicate some of the lessons from not only the small grants program, but also from CCRD generally to USAID and other donors, you can just give me an email. It's at michaelcody@agility.com. Thanks a lot.
Michael, I will say kudos for managing 36 grants. I'm sure you didn't do it alone, but I think we've found small grants to be incredibly exciting, and that we see a lot of incredible ideas coming from what are often very small awards, but it is a labor-intensive process. So wrapping up now, Jonathan Cook.
Yes, wrapping up, and I'm sure everybody's eager to wrap up and to get the chance to go and have some drinks and some food and continue talking. So we'll try to wrap up and move into the Q&A pretty quickly. I'm Jonathan Cook. I'm a adaptation specialist with the GCC office here at USAID, and I've been very pleased and proud to be working with the CCRD team over the last couple of years. I came in about 3 years ago, so I wasn't there for the genesis that John described this morning, where the project and the framework kind of emerged, but I've been able to see a lot of the results and the ways in which the different parts of the programs have come together. And I think you've seen today that it's a very wide-ranging set of activities, but with some very common themes. And I'm going to try to talk a little bit about some of those themes, maybe some overarching lessons that have come out, as well as a few ideas for kind of the next directions where we see things going. I think that's a conversation we're really looking to all of you to help us continue this week, especially there's a session on Thursday that's devoted to it. But this is kind of a chance to see where the future lies a little bit for us. I'm going to put up one more time for today the CRD framework, because during the reception, Pablo's going to be doing a game to make sure that you all remember every word of it. Just kidding. But again, I think we feel that this framework, it really is the kind of the connective tissue. It's something that really connects this project and a lot of the work that you've heard about today and that you'll hear about this week. It really is, I think, a conceptual approach that holds a lot of that together. So I'm going to talk a little bit about lessons. I put together some ideas, a couple of lessons that I see coming out of the CCRD program. I did it before today, and I have to say, and this is probably a good thing, I think we've heard a lot of these today. I think in a lot of ways this is going to be a synthesis or a wrap-up or a summary of some of the ideas that have come out already in the presentations. But maybe there'll be a few new things for everybody to think about as well. One is this idea of mainstreaming. So, we talked a lot about the framework being very flexible, working at a lot of different levels, from local up to regional even. But I think the common idea here that people have stressed is the importance of an entry point or a process for this framework to really work. You need your Vision 2030, you need your LAPA process in the case of the mountain work, you need your urban planning processes, you need something that you can really link this onto for it to be successful. And again, that helps to align with existing processes of planning and of financing, which really are where the rubber hits the road. Otherwise, you just have yet another process that kind of sits off in space. And one of the ways we've, I think, seen that also really works in practice is in the process of donor coordination and partnership. If we don't get others who are supporting development work in the countries where we're working to sort of sign on to or attach themselves or align with the processes, then everybody's doing their own thing. And we've seen that in a lot of places in the past, and it doesn't work. It adds to the burden. It complicates things. And so really we're not in any way, I think, with this framework trying to replace. We're looking to find ways, entry points where we can add value and align. A second kind of overarching idea that I think you've heard a lot about today is information, and information for decision making. It's not information for its own sake, right? So we've heard a lot about the types of information that different users can actually use and make, apply in the work that they're doing at a sort of in a development context, whether it's farmers who need forecasts for next season or infrastructure planners who need to think 30, 50 years in advance, or at least should be thinking further in advance. So it's a lot about timescales, and it's a lot about formats. So we had some interesting discussions about, the different types of ways people get information, written, non-written, the idea of maps, which are often a very powerful tool, and we've seen some examples of that. I think we're going to hear about some of the tools that have been used in places like Jamaica to work with farmers on things like drought forecasts, where they have a very specific need, and the challenge is finding the way to communicate with them and do that in a way that actually helps them. We talked a lot about capacity building and in a broader sense, but I think it really resonates with this information side of things, right? People are intimidated by climate information, in my experience, and I think a lot of our experience. And so in addition to thinking about formats, it's also thinking about people's capacity to actually take in information and use it and apply it in the ways that they're making decisions. So there's been some interesting examples of how that's been happening through workshops and capacity building for groups like the Met Services, but also for users of information, farmers and people at the local level. And just to kind of conclude on that, I think on Thursday we're going to talk a lot about climate services and the growing importance that whole area really has for development. I mean, I think this issue of what information for whom and in what formats, it's coming up all over the place in USAID's work and in a lot of the development community. And I think we're seeing a really heightened attention and interest in that at the highest levels of the U.S. government and a lot of the other donors and of course in the countries where we do our work. So I think this is a real growth area that hopefully we'll talk a lot more about. Multi-sectoral, multi-stakeholder approaches. I mean, this is a phrase we've heard for many, many years, but I think it resonates for me, particularly with this approach to climate resilient development where more than ever, in a sense, you really need to think about getting all of the right actors together, especially at the beginning in terms of scoping, thinking about, what's your problem, what's your challenge, what questions are you trying to answer? And if you don't have everyone in the room, you're not likely to frame the questions themselves in a way that will lead to integrated answers. And so, again, the example from Jamaica this morning of trying to really, it's a lot of people in a room in a process that's complicated, but if you don't start with that sense of engagement and ownership, it backfires later. We heard about some other good examples of that, again, with things like the local adaptation planning, the working groups that the CRIS team set up in some of the cities where they were working. So I think there's a lot of good examples of how to do that. And then working across sectors, the ELO example that we just heard from Jason about, where nominally it's focused, it was a case study that focused on the water sector, but when you start to think about, of course, water is a great example where it touches on other sectors, it's used by other sectors, and you really want to be bringing them in and including them in the process of thinking what options should be implemented. And we talked a lot, of course, also about this link between sort of top-down and bottom-up, and how do we bring together local communities and their inputs and perspectives with national processes, and focusing on vulnerable groups, or maybe we should say marginal groups. But I think, for those of us who work or who have worked, in my case, in the sort of at the field level, we know how often you see processes that exclude those who are being affected by the issues in question. And climate change is a great example where we have to really think about ways to broaden that and combine those types of approaches. And I think we had some good, again, approaches and examples that people will, I think, expand on this week. Final point I wanted to talk a bit about was implementation, right? So a lot of what the CRD framework has been able to add, not only, but a lot, has been on that first couple of stages that you saw in the diagram. It's a lot about, thinking about identifying problems and starting to work with planning processes to address them. In some cases, we've started to really push into implementation, and I think that's obviously where the stakeholders, the partners, the groups we work with, the countries we work in, that's where they want to see things go. To get beyond planning, although planning's really important, and think about results, think about integrating into programs and actual activities on the ground. And so things like the action plans that the CRIS program has done, thinking about some of the examples from the LAPA process where they were able to actually get funding to do some very concrete actions. I think those are the kinds of examples we want to sort of push towards more of in the future. Financing is going to be a huge part of that, and we've talked a little bit about the mix of different funding sources that countries are going to be looking to in the future to help pay for adaptation. And it's going to be a mix of public and private funds. It's going to be about realigning budgets in some cases to try to incorporate these new challenges. But one thing that we really think helps is getting behind these strategic planning processes as a start, right? So the NAP process, or at the local level, something like the LAPA process, it's a way to organize priorities. It's a way to get buy-in and to get, again, other donors and other actors to sort of agree, these are the most important priorities. These are where future funding should go, because it's finite. It's always going to be finite. USAID is a part of the response, but there's never going to be enough funding out there. And one other thing I would add is, and this has really been an important alignment sort of change and direction for USAID, has been thinking about readiness. So, it's one thing to get money, but it's another to use it in an effective way. And, one of the other limiting factors in a lot of countries on the capacity side is managing and mobilizing the funding, so getting more of it, but also understanding where to put it, how to manage it, how to integrate it into the planning and finance processes themselves. And so we see a real need, and I think we've started to do some work in this area on helping countries get ready for finance. And with some of the new funding that's coming from things like the Green Climate Fund and some of these private sector opportunities that you heard about, I think that's going to be more important than ever in the future. So future directions is something we're going to talk a lot more about on Thursday, but I wanted to just mention a couple really quickly before we wrap. Again, how do we bridge adaptation and development? The CRD framework has tried to be a bridge to show that we can't keep doing climate change as its own separate sector or separate activity. It's got to be part of the development process more broadly. And so the framework was really all about, again, mapping onto existing processes, not setting up some brand new thing that's off to the side. And I'd say the other part of that is, there's been a focus on something that people like to call climate proofing, which is, you have a project or you're building something, you make it climate proof, whatever that means. And I think that gets us so far, but again, if we don't look at the bigger picture and we don't think about institutionalization, right? How do we get this reflected in the actual institutions, the way that they do business, the way that they think, the way that they plan? And I think somebody, maybe it was Joel, alluded earlier to the idea of adaptive institutions. How do you actually get some of our partners in these countries that we work with to do things a little bit differently? And then the second one I would mention is about tools. So we've had some great examples of some of the tools that have come out of CCRD in terms of making decisions. We're going to hear from our colleague from Vietnam about the climate impacts decision support tool, for example, that they use there. But there's a lot of, I think, need in this space for applied tools that help people make better decisions. Take the information and actually make decisions about which climate or non-climate stressors to focus on, for example, or which adaptations to choose from. have to say I've never heard of adaptation options matrix described as sexy before, as it was before. But I think we need it to be sexier, right? We need to get that kind of a tool to really help us to make decisions about really, in some cases, very difficult decisions. You know, you've got resources and you have to make decisions about which ones which resources to use for which options. Finally, just to end again on a CRD framework note. I mean, I think we've seen a lot of really exciting results from this project and from the work we've been able to do with some of our USAID missions and their country partners around the world. We've gotten great interest from the broader community in the framework and in the annexes and all the documents that are out on the table. We've worked with some other donors, people mentioned earlier, to try to share this approach. We've worked with some interesting regional partners like ECOWAS, which was mentioned. But we want to do more. We want all of your help, I think, in showing the virtues of this approach. And it's not just as a document or a product, but as an approach, as a way to think about doing better climate resilient development and better adaptation. And so I think this is something we look for, again, a discussion on, where all of you who work in this space can kind of hopefully help us improve the framework and the approach, but also get it out and get it used and get it more broadly applied. So thanks a lot. Looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Jonathan. A lot of really great points that we can hopefully get some responses to in the discussion. You just to sort of tee this discussion up, one of the things that you mentioned was, moving to implementation and going beyond what I think for the first, decade or so of a focus on adaptation. What we really ended up doing was assessing, planning, and coming back to kind of the question of why. Why did we feel like something new had to be said about climate resilient development? Page 3 sort of talks about the fact that climate information is essential, but when we start with it, we may not be using resources efficiently or effectively. And so there are a few points in the document, including that a start with climate information can be too broad and doesn't help us really go anywhere quickly. There can be a mismatch of the time frames of the information that you get by starting with projections, for example, versus planning time frames and time horizons. It can give uncertainty too big a role, because if you're already starting with future projections, you're actually not starting with what you know. And finally, information is not always actionable when it comes from that place first, instead of starting with, well, what questions do we really have? And so to the panel, I will say, those are some of the reasons that we wrote why this framework would be a helpful one. Are any of those particularly true in your experience? Are we more cost effective and efficient with our efforts by doing things this way? And do you have any examples for that? Glenn, you've been doing USAID projects a long time. Do you have thoughts on that?
I'm still waiting for a successful one. Well, there was Alan Bassis is here, so he heard me say this in a meeting. All the countries have to do these communications, the UNFCCC communications. And before we started CCRD, we started looking at, there had been almost no work done on what the implications for climate change would be for yields in Kazakhstan. And then I got a hold of the communication that they'd written, and they were saying that for yields were going to go down by 60% in a period of like 30 or 40 years. And I was like, no, come on, guys, that can't be possible. And the problem is they don't have a good, they do not have a good crop model to work with, because, the weather is getting warmer. I mean, Kazakhstan is just, south of, the Urals, and their growing conditions are getting better. The growing season is getting longer. The issues that you can't really look at with the climate information that's available is how is variability going to change? You know, because in wheat production, you've got temperature that's important before you can put the seed in the ground. You can't have too much heat when the wheat is flowering. You need the rain after it's flowered so that the ears of wheat actually set, and then you're scared to death that you're going to get rain in the later season. So one, I chastised in that meeting for their prediction that it was 60%. I said, you can't make that kind of a statement. One, it's not true. And I'd seen some studies that said, I talked to the people at IRI, and they said, no way, there's no 60% reduction in wheat occurring in that region. But part of the problem is the climate information they really need is how is variability going to change over time. And when they talk about variability, it's not just looking at annual precipitation or annual temperatures. They need microdata. They need information during those 4 or 5 months that the wheat's growing. So I think that there's a lot of frustration. And also, we have to keep in mind that when we're talking about farmers, their livelihoods are at stake. They make a bad decision. It's not like, oh, well, we'll do better next year. I mean, they don't have the money to plant next year, or they don't have. And in the last 3 or 4 years, they've actually had commercial farms go bankrupt, several of them every year. And that part of it's because of all the uncertainty associated with climate information.
Well, so just reflect what I'm hearing you say is, if the question becomes, from the long-term scenarios, what's going to happen to wheat, there's not much you can do with that, and it wasn't even accurate in that case, versus understanding what decisions people are making over specific timescales and how to feed information into those decisions.
Yeah, I mean, the thing that's interesting, like the AgMet AgMet program has 3 components. They have an economic component, they have a production component, and they have a climate component. And you can't make these projections unless you pay attention to all 3, because one of the issues is farmers don't care about production, they care about profits. Their production go down, but if the prices stay acceptable and they can control costs, they can still make money. So you have to really do this in an integrated way. And I think we focus too narrowly on the climate information and trying to work with it without realizing that you have to take a systemic approach, and you have to consider, if it's a natural resource, how does it grow, and you've got to consider markets as well.
Great. Joanne and Jason, as private sector people helping USAID get the most value out of its programs, do you have thoughts on that question? How do we use some of these approaches to be more cost effective with our adaptation work?
Yeah. Well, I'm not sure if this directly responds to that question, but one of the things that I think thinking about timeframes and timescales is very helpful in diagnosis and making sure you get the right assessment of vulnerability that's relevant to that decision. But it's also helpful in designing your adaptation strategies and getting away from the sense that all your adaptation responses have to be structural and long-term major investments. In the Peru context, the city of Piura is subject to really extreme weather, precipitation events, El Nino events, and massive flooding. And so they're naturally very concerned about adequate drainage and figuring out, the big water management, flood management system that will require probably some serious investments in infrastructure. But they have a solid waste problem that clogs the drains. And if, no matter how good their infrastructure is, if they can't have a routine maintenance approach, their flood management system won't work. So the annual data makes all the difference in the world to the managers who are trying to keep those streets clean and keep the drains working. So I think focusing on the portfolio of adaptation strategies that you need to bring to the table and the different sorts of weather and climate information that will be relevant to those actors is equally important.
So maybe it helps us find lower cost adaptation options in some cases.
Without a doubt.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Jason, you want to comment?
Well, as a cutthroat consultant,
Yes, please.
if that's the angle you're looking for,
Looking for value.
there's always a bottom line, right? And I would be looking to get the biggest bang for my buck. The beauty of the climate resilient development framework, to me, is that it doesn't present you with an answer; it presents you with questions. It really needs to be treated as a heuristic tool or a framework that allows you to make sense of the context in which you find yourself. And it has a particular focus on climate resilience, but it's a secondary focus, right? The primary focus are your objectives. And if your objectives, like most developing countries, happen to be feeding your population, increasing economic growth, then this tool is very useful for that. With the example of Iloilo, right, we walked in to do a climate change and water security assessment, and we walked out saying that, out of the 22 adaptation options, there was something like 18 of them that had something to do with a non-climate stressor or governance, because you couldn't actually tackle some of these issues before you either got the governance fixed, or I don't want to say fixed, until you overcame significant governance obstacles, or until you tackled fundamental problems with the water distribution system, or the way that the city was arranged with respect to the river. So from a USAID perspective, if I'm putting my dollar on a development project, the framework itself is a great way to actually prioritize where those dollars should go on a context-by-context basis, and probably even to justify it through, if these are climate dollars that are stovepiped in the climate pipe, right? But you've done a climate vulnerability assessment that shows that we need to do some fundamental work on governance and these other things. I think that's going to be a stronger case to make, that the value you bring to the table is through diversifying where you do this work. And I like to talk forever, so I'll just stop.
That's perfect. What about questions from the audience? Yeah, we have one here. Take a couple. Or one more in front, I think. It's pointing right there, yep.
Hi, my name is John Waugh, and I'm with Integra LLC. And my question, I think, is mainly for Jonathan, but anybody may, perhaps. I see mainstreaming, the expression mainstreaming, becoming more and more prevalent, and I worry sometimes that I wonder if there's a risk of mainstreaming fatigue within the agency and within the development community, broadly speaking. And if there is, what can be done to avoid it?
What more? Hands up again, because I didn't get another one. Sure, right here.
Eric Boyle with the ICF. It seems that a common thread that's running through all these presentations is the project acting as an honest and informed broker for having these multidisciplinary, multi-sector conversations, whether it's at the local level or the national level or the regional level in some cases. My question is, can that brokerage actually be outsourced to local actors? Just curious, working with some of the local partners that you've been working with in these projects, is it possible to see them carrying on and being able to use some of the tools that are developed, or are there barriers to that? Thanks.
Great. Jonathan, do you want to take the first one on mainstreaming fatigue?
Sure. Well, I guess I would ask maybe a follow-up question, which is do you find that the fatigue is with the term or the idea behind it? Because I think the term does definitely get overused, and I think maybe we should have a small grant competition to come up with a new way to describe this. But no, I mean, in all honesty, it certainly is a phrase that's been around for a long time before climate came along. I mean, I remember working on mainstreaming of environment into poverty alleviation programs, for example, and that was like the beginning of my career. So, yeah, it's a bit of a nebulous concept, but I think the idea behind it, whatever we want to call it, if anything, we're only still on the cusp, right? I mean, I think the challenge for me with all of this climate resilient development work is that we haven't really succeeded in, except for some notable and nice exceptions, in really forcing climate into the actual programs, policies, agencies, et cetera, that are doing all the other economic work of importance in a lot of the countries. We have some great examples of the sort of Jamaica example of the different ministries kind of pushing down, and Cambodia, I think Joel found that there's a bit of a similar approach that's being taken there. But when you sort of shake the term, what comes out is still, I would argue, anecdotal. And so I think we may need to repackage it and talk about it in a somewhat more compelling way, and I think that's a really good point. But I think the actual process is fundamental if we're going to really get climate, both the attention it deserves, but also the context it deserves, in the sense that it shouldn't always be the end-all and the be-all. It should be seen as part of the broader, development goals, et cetera, that we're talking about here. So, thanks.
I might just add one comment on mainstreaming and mainstreaming fatigue, which is we want it to become sort of a default consideration while still remaining rigorous. And if I think myself about how I've had to learn about gender to be better at mainstreaming gender into what I do, I know now to ask the question, and I know enough about it to know what I don't know. And so I think we need a little bit the same approach on this, which is to get people fluent enough to be asking the right questions, but then still knowing where to tap into real expertise to go deeper. And that's a really big challenge for USAID to do effectively internally, but also for all of our partners externally to do well. It's a great question.
I can take Eric's question. I think it's really important to outsource it. Projects end, and the worst thing that happens, and all of you that work in development know this, you go back a couple of years later and there's almost no evidence, no footprint at all that your project existed. And I think that USAID Forward is helpful in this respect, but I think the main thing we have to do is we have to work with local partners that are going to be on the ground and hopefully can find other financing to be sustained. And just a few examples, the group from Macedonia is a local NGO, and they are becoming rather famous in Macedonia, and everybody wants to work with them. They've started out working with very small municipalities, and now they're getting requests from larger municipalities to work with them. So there's a chance of sustainability there. In Peru, Jenny and I and a couple other people trained TMIs, the Mountain Institute's local people, and they in turn did quite a few stakeholder workshops and have continued some of the work using this approach. In Kazakhstan, we trained a number of quite good trainers, and we developed curriculum so that they could continue to teach farmers about climate change adaptation. Alex Guerra's organization was a recipient of a grant. And how many farmers have you trained? Around 400. And Alex, you're going back to Guatemala, aren't you? So, I mean, the sustainability is there. I think we just have to be more, we all like to do the work, but it's important for us to get other people to do it. And one of the effective ways to do it is to train other people and work with local partners and help. If they can own the work, I think there's a better chance of it being sustained.
Some more questions. I'm trying to look for diversity, but we've got two more over here.
Oh, it's a planted question.
This will be a softball.
Not
So Peter Schultz, ICF. Building on the discussion of mainstreaming, I think there are a couple of other areas that we should be thinking about, a couple of terms that don't replace mainstreaming but build from it. One is streamlining. So how do we do this mainstreaming, but do it in the most streamlined way possible? That, as Jenny was saying, it's robust. It leads to good conclusions, but we've learned through this process and are able to do it in a streamlined way. Second term that I think for us to think about is scaling. How do we scale this up? We've done these pilots, but we haven't really demonstrated going to scale. like across the agency, and in a couple of other dimensions. So how do we scale? The third kind of term for us to think about building on mainstreaming is maybe validation. I think for us to really kind of get into the big leagues on this, we need to demonstrate that what we're doing is effective. There will come a time when it won't suffice for us to say, you know, we've kind of moistened our finger, stuck it up in the air, and we think it's good. So why is it good? How do we know that it's good? How do we know that approach A is better than approach B? So I'd like to ask the panel to reflect on what they see as some of the directions to kind of take what we've done in CCRD and really kind of catapult it into the big leagues. What do we need to do?
And then one right behind.
Ian Fitzsimmons, Still Point Solutions. So driving in this morning to Washington, I listened to NPR, and Garrison Keillor was doing his little Poets Corner thing. This morning he was talking about James Madison, and he read some experts from James Madison speaking about where America as a country was during his administration. I think he was the 4th president, and he said, I'm paraphrasing, it's very scary right now. We don't really know what we're doing. We're trying to figure a lot of stuff out, and it's a bit overawing. Those who follow us will have an easier time of it. And I want to say, in the context, I think that this project, this project should be considered, maybe not on quite the same scale, but sort of in that context. What this project has done is path breaking in a lot of ways. There's been a lot of really good, thoughtful conceptualization. The overall approach has been done very carefully, and again with a great deal of thought. And it's really terrific to have an opportunity like this now to come and sort of look at all that's been done and say, where do we go from here, and how can we improve, how can we do better? But the comments on how we can improve and how we can do better should be considered against the backdrop of what has been done already, which is very substantial. One thing, listening in this lessons learned session, listening to the various comments, one thing that struck me that I've heard several times is sort of the stovepiping of resources, and that I can't think of exactly the right word. It's not turf, but it's the organization of responsibilities so that they are not inherently interoperable, or the momentum isn't towards crossing lines. And I just wanted to mention 2 things. One is the idea of management by objectives, which is an approach that AID adopted back in the 90s. As a budgeting technique, I've seen that used for U.S. cities, for example, the city of Charlotte, North Carolina. And I've seen it used in USAID projects, community development projects. It was done on a very large scale in Indonesia, for example, in the aughts, in the 2000s. And by organizing your budget around objectives rather than around disciplines or around departments, you lean towards interoperability. You bias your system towards departments working together. And the second thing is the idea of, I've heard adaptation discussed very persuasively in the context of insurance. Now, from a humanitarian point of view, insurance isn't the most automatically appealing idea. But the idea that when you see a risk, you make some provision to deal with it is, I think, quite persuasive and apt in this context. And what insurance people are very, very good at is assessing risk, evaluating risk, maybe in the corporate context for purposes of profit. But in humanitarian context, that can be for purposes of prioritization, prioritizing vulnerabilities. So I think that borrowing some of their arguments and techniques could be another way to sort of bias operation in favor of interoperability a little bit. Consider adaptation vulnerability as a continuum of existing risks and problems rather than something fresh. And in that way, it's very much in keeping with the structure, the framework that you've developed so far.
Great, thank you. So two somewhat related questions. How do we do more with what's been done here? How do we become more streamlined, scaled, validated? This first question, and then also operate better in a holistic sense, perhaps thinking about risk maybe as a tool for that across timescales. Who wants to respond to either or both of those? Jason?
I like them. Those are good questions. And I'll try and be quick because I know we don't have a lot of time, and I think Glenn probably deserves the last word after all the work he's put into this project over years. He's only 28. Did you know that? So one is starting this line that began with mainstreaming fatigue, and the problem is spin. We need to, as a community, we all suffer from this, and we need to stop spinning fancy terms like mainstreaming, which I kind of have a problem with, streamlining, robust versus resilient. You know, you could just put that in the title of a report, and people are going to automatically feel warm and fuzzy about it. We need to stop engaging in sloppy thinking, and I think that's how we become more effective, is by not engaging in sloppy thinking. Mainstreaming actually means something real, and if we use it to mean that thing, which is instead of every single time we tackle a project, a development project, somebody in the room asks the climate question. Well, how is climate going to affect this? That's not mainstreaming. That's just, you're lucky that somebody smart is in the room. Mainstreaming is when you build that process in at a constitutive level, to be a little nerdy about it. When the way that the questions are asked demand that somebody in the room answers that question, whether they're qualified to or not, in order for the project to move on. We do need to get there. And to just end on Peter's big point, which is how do we catapult ourselves into the big leagues, which is mixing metaphors from time periods. It's kind of, I like it. I would say there's one really simple answer, which is if you look at the Climate Resilient Development Framework, if you look at the framework, almost all of the work we've done, even through this project, focuses on the first three stages, right? Scope, assess, design. Where we need to be relevant is in implement and evaluate. And if we can move the vast majority of our work from it being sort of maybe a 90-10 split towards those first three stages to a 90% split towards those last two stages, we are relevant. And we no longer have to answer the question because we're doing it.
So I can point to implementation in each of the CRIS pilots by locals, by those local governments where they have changed things that will ensure more resilience going forward in their decision making. So I think that's great. And I also think we've got a ton more work to do because we've generated some good approaches, good tools, and it's not out there as much as it needs to be. And so the question in my mind is, who are the actors who will pick up this information, keep the dialogue going? How does the Ministry of Finance in Peru start talking with other ministries about the policies that they've instituted to embed climate risk as part of their decision-making process, because other countries can benefit from that. So I think I would like to see a whole lot more discussion this week about how we enable the organizations and the governments that we've worked with to carry it out, to really take it to scale, as Peter was saying.
Great.
This really great questions. I've been making notes all over the place and try to see if I can figure them out. I want to go to the scale question that Peter raised first. When we work in development, aid is always looking for champions, because if they don't have a champion to implement a project and the project doesn't go very well, then you don't go and spend the money in that place again, and sort of thing. So we look for ministers that are really creative in that. But I think the champion that we really need is to take things to scale. We don't need implementation partners. We need people that can go out there and continue to push the case. And I'm sorry I keep going back to our group in Macedonia, but they're in the process of trying to go to scale outside of Macedonia. they're planning to do a workshop and try to take the green agenda with the climate components that we've helped them with to other Balkan nations, and to try to, to that. And so they're an NGO, so they're not like, when we think of champions, we think of a Ministry of Environment or a Ministry of Water or a mayor or municipal person. So I think we need to think more broadly about who we need to be champions. And I think without champions, we can't go to scale. I think that the other place that we need champions is in AID. If we can't get the missions to buy into this and to think from a climate resilient development framework, then it doesn't matter how good the guidance is, it doesn't matter how good the GCC office is, that you have to get traction in the missions. And I think that that's the key to really going to scale, going through that route. On the fatigue issue, I'm not sure fatigue's the right word, but I think the key issue is incentives. One of the reasons we haven't gotten to implementation is money. That we've done some really good planning processes. We've had some really good assessment and design that we've done, but they don't have any resources to be able to implement a lot of the things. And I think that until that money is there, and when that money is there, there will be incentives. There will be incentives. And I think that fatigue it's like, it's like when I was working in Poland as an advisor to the minister, and I went into the international office, and there were like 500 reports on the thing. And the international guy says, yeah, everybody wants to do reports, so we just say, yeah, go ahead and do the reports, and we just put them on the shelf, and they do nothing with them. And unfortunately, that's what's going to happen with the adaptation plans and the strategies, that if we don't make the connection to the resources, we're not going to overcome that fatigue and really get to implementation.
Excellent. Well, all of my concluding remarks have now been said, but I think what's this point about implementation, CCRD was a global program, and USAID implements the majority of its resources through field programs. And so this was an attempt to pilot, to demonstrate, to really kick off the beginning of the climate change initiative with some good examples and models. And so I think this is an excellent point of sort of pivoting. We've got the president saying every development project needs to think about climate risk. We've got missions that have been trained on climate change and really know a little bit more, at least, about what to do about it. So I think it's a good moment for CCRD to be winding down and really the momentum to pick up in the field. So thank you to the panel. What's the transition from here? Reception. So follow each other in some direction. And let's thank the panelists. Thank you for staying with us today. Oh, okay. Change of plan. Sorry.
Ralph?
Is Rolf here?
He's here,
Or should we do it out at the reception?
Yeah, in there.
Okay, continue as planned.
So I'd like to be 28 again, I think, especially if my kids were already grown up. That was really good.